Marcus Webb's hammer rang against iron with the desperation of a man forging his last chance at survival. Each strike echoing through the empty streets like a prayer no one would answer. The weight of unpaid debts pressed heavier on his shoulders than the 20-pound sledge in his calloused hands, and tonight, like every night for the past month, he worked alone while the rest of Millhaven shuttered their shops and returned to warm hearths he'd never know. The anvil sang its familiar song under his blows, sparks dancing in the dim light of his forge like dying stars. Sweat carved clean tracks through the soot on his face, each drop carrying the salt of worry that had become his constant companion. The horseshoe beneath his hammer was the third he'd shaped today, payment for a debt that should have been settled weeks ago. Lord Ashford's steward would come again tomorrow, patient as winter and twice as cold, expecting the iron work that kept Marcus one step ahead of the debtor's prison. His shoulders ached with the rhythm he'd known since boyhood, when his father's strong hands had guided his own around this very hammer. But his father had never worked in shadows, never counted coins by candlelight, never felt the hollow gnaw of a supper skipped to buy coal for the forge. The shop that had once bustled with apprentices and customers now held only echoes and the bitter scent of cooling metal. Marcus paused, wiping his brow with a sleeve already blackened beyond redemption. Through the open doorway, he could see the warm glow spilling from cottage windows, hear the distant laughter of children being tucked into beds he'd helped forge the nails for. Once he'd imagined his own children running between these very walls, their voices bright as the ring of steel on steel. But Sarah had been in the ground 3 winters now, and the dreams had grown as cold as the iron waiting for tomorrows. Heat, the horseshoe cooled from orange to red to black, and still Marcus held it with his tongs, watching his reflection waver in its curved surface. 32 years old, and what did he have to show for it? A shop mortgaged beyond hope, a bed that held only memories, and hands that knew nothing but the weight of iron and the burn of forge fire. Outside, the cathedral bells tolled vespers, their bronze voices carrying across the cobblestones like a benediction he couldn't afford to receive. Marcus set the horseshoe aside and began banking his fire, the familiar motions as automatic as breathing. Another day ending, another night of solitude beginning, another tomorrow that promised nothing but the same desperate rhythm of hammer on anvil. He didn't know that by tomorrow's end, everything would change. The storm arrived like grief, sudden, overwhelming, and without mercy. Rain lashed against the shutters with fingers of wind that found every crack in the workshop walls, turning Marcus's carefully banked coals into hissing protests. He'd barely secured the loose boards over his windows when he heard it. 3 soft knocks against his door, barely audible above the thunder's rage. Marcus stilled, hammer halfway to the anvil. No one traveled in weather like this. The roads would be rivers of mud, treacherous even for a man alone, impossible for a family. Yet the knocking came again, more urgent now, accompanied by a voice that cut through the storm's fury like a blade through silk. "Please," a woman called, her words nearly lost in the wind. "My children." He opened the door to find them huddled against the elements like sparrows before a hawk. The woman stood with her back to the rain, 3 small figures pressed against her sodden cloak. Her dark hair hung in wet tendrils around a face sharp with exhaustion, eyes that held the kind of desperation Marcus recognized in his own mirror. Behind her, barely visible in the storm's shadow, 3 pairs of wide eyes stared up at him with the trust that only children could manage in the face of terror. "The inn," Marcus began, then stopped. The White Hart had closed its doors to all, but paying customers, and these 4 had the look of souls who counted their wealth in heartbeats, not silver. "We've walked since dawn," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The children cannot go further." One of the little ones, a girl with hair the color of autumn wheat, swayed on her feet. Her brother caught her arm with the instinctive care of a child who'd learned too young to watch over others. The third child, another boy, pressed closer to his mother's side, silent as a shadow. Marcus felt the familiar weight of choice settling on his shoulders, heavier than any hammer he'd ever lifted. His shop was barely large enough for one man's solitude, his larder empty, save for a heel of bread and the last of his ale. Taking in 4 strangers would strain resources he didn't possess, invite questions from neighbors he couldn't answer. But the girl's knees buckled again, and her mother's arm tightened around all 3 children with a fierceness that spoke of love stronger than pride. "Come in," Marcus heard himself say, stepping aside before wisdom could reclaim his tongue. "Quickly, before the wind takes the door." They stumbled inside like refugees from a shipwreck, bringing with them the scent of rain and something else, the indefinable fragrance of hope clinging to desperation's edge. Marcus's quarters above the shop had never seemed smaller than they did with 4 additional souls breathing the same air. The single room that had once felt spacious enough for a man's solitude now pressed against them like a too-tight doublet, every movement carefully measured to avoid collision. Elena sat on the edge of his bed, the only place to sit besides the single wooden stool, while her children arranged themselves on the floor like fallen leaves, each finding their own small territory in the cramped space. The girl, Anna, had claimed the corner nearest the small window, her dark eyes watching raindrops race down the glass with the intensity of a scholar reading ancient texts. Sophia, golden-haired and still pale from exhaustion, curled against the wall with her thumb tucked between her lips, a habit her mother gently discouraged with soft Spanish words that sounded like lullabies. Miguel, the boy who'd steadied his sister in the doorway, sat cross-legged near his mother's feet, his gaze moving between Marcus and the door as if calculating distances and exits. "They won't trouble you," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who understood the fragility of charity. "We'll be gone when the storm passes," Marcus nodded, though something in his chest tightened at the words. He busied himself with stoking the small brazier that served as both heat and cooking fire, aware of how Eleanor's eyes followed his every movement. She watched like a woman who'd learned to read danger in the set of a man's shoulders, the speed of his step, the tone of his voice when he thought no one was listening. "Mama," Sophia whispered, tugging at her mother's wet sleeve. "My stomach hurts." Elena's hand moved to stroke her daughter's damp hair, the gesture automatic as breathing. "I know, pequeña. Rest now." Marcus found himself studying their faces in the brazier's glow. 3 children who shared their mother's dark eyes, but carried themselves with the careful stillness of those who'd learned not to take up too much space in the world. They were clean despite their travel, their clothes mended with the neat stitches of a woman who took pride in small dignities even when larger ones had been stripped away. "There's bread," he offered awkwardly, gesturing toward the heel that represented tomorrow's breakfast. "And ale." "You're kind," Elena replied, but her hands remained folded in her lap, accepting nothing without permission first given and received. The silence stretched between them, filled with the storm's diminishing fury and the soft sound of children's breathing. Marcus realized he'd forgotten what it felt like to share space with others, to feel responsible for more than his own survival. The weight of their presence was different from the weight of iron, warmer, more complex, infinitely more fragile. Outside, the rain began to gentleness, and with it came the unspoken question that hung between them like incense. What would tomorrow bring? Morning light filtered through the workshop's high windows like golden dust, illuminating a scene Marcus had never imagined in his ordered world. Anna stood mesmerized before the great bellows, her small hands tracing the leather folds with reverent curiosity, while Miguel crouched beside a pile of iron rods, studying their different weights and lengths with the intensity of a merchant appraising goods. Sophia had discovered the bucket of quenching water, her reflection wavering on its dark surface as she whispered secrets to the girl looking back. "Careful," Marcus found himself saying as Anna reached toward the cold forge, her fingers drawn to the mysterious opening like a moth to flame. Even cold, the stones hold memory of heat. She pulled back immediately, eyes wide with apology. But Marcus surprised himself by kneeling beside her. "Here," he said gently, guiding her small hand to touch the cool outer stones. "Feel how thick they are. They protect the fire. Keep it where it belongs." From the corner where Eleanor sorted their few belongings, he caught the soft intake of breath, the way her hands stilled over a worn traveling cloak. She watched every interaction with the vigilance of a mother bird, ready to swoop down if any shadow fell across her children. Miguel approached with a horseshoe in his grimy fist, the one Marcus had shaped just yesterday in his desperation to meet Lord Ashford's demands. "This is for horses?" the boy asked, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone still learning the common tongue. "Aye," Marcus replied, setting down his hammer, "to protect their hooves from stones and wear." He demonstrated how the shoe would fit, the boy's dark head nodding with understanding that went deeper than words. "Papa made shoes," Miguel said, quietly, then clamped his mouth shut as if the words had escaped without permission. Marcus felt something twist in his chest, not pain exactly, but recognition. The careful way the boy held the iron, the knowledge that flickered behind his eyes spoke of a child who'd watched a craftsman's hands at work. "Did he teach you?" Marcus asked. Miguel's nod was almost imperceptible, and from across the room, Elena's sharp intake of breath told Marcus he'd stumbled into territory marked with old grief. Sophia's voice broke the tension like a bell. "Why is it so heavy?" she asked, trying unsuccessfully to lift one of the smaller hammers with both hands. "Because gentle won't shape iron," Marcus explained, lifting the tool easily. "Sometimes the most beautiful things require the strongest touch." Elena rose then, moving toward them with fluid grace. "Children, you mustn't—" "They're doing no harm," Marcus said, and the words carried more weight than he'd intended. In the sudden silence that followed, he realized something had shifted, not just in the morning light, but in the very air they breathed together. Elena moved through Marcus's kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who'd learned to make much from little, her hands transforming yesterday's heel of bread and a handful of dried herbs into something that filled the small space with warmth. But it was when she descended to the workshop that Marcus felt the first stirring of true curiosity about the woman who'd sought shelter in his storm. She paused beside his workbench, her dark eyes taking in the scattered tools with an assessment that went beyond idle interest. When she reached for the smaller tongs without hesitation, Marcus almost spoke to warn her away from the dangerous implements. Instead, he watched in growing amazement as her fingers closed around the handles with the confidence of familiarity. "The angle is wrong," she said quietly, nodding toward the horseshoe he'd been struggling to shape. "The heel should curve deeper to match the natural fall of the hoof." Marcus blinked, the criticism so unexpected he nearly dropped his own hammer. "You know metalwork?" Eleanor's hands stilled on the tongs, and for a moment he thought she might retreat into the careful politeness she'd worn like armor. Instead, she moved to the cold forge, her movements betraying a knowledge that couldn't be feigned. "My husband was a smith," she said simply. "In Toledo. I helped when he would allow it." The way she said the last words carried shadows of old battles, and Marcus found himself watching her hands as she turned the horseshoe in the dim light. Her fingers traced the iron's curve with the sensitivity of someone who understood the language of metal, who could read the stories told in its grain and temper. "Toledo," Marcus repeated, respect coloring his voice. "Spanish steel was legendary, even here in the northern reaches of England, prized by knights and nobles for its superior edge and lasting strength." Your husband must have been a master craftsman. He was gifted, Elena agreed, though something in her tone suggested gifts and wisdom didn't always travel together. She set the horseshoe down carefully, as if handling a sleeping serpent. But gifts can be complicated things. From the corner where the children had built a fortress of empty grain sacks, Anna's laugh rang out like silver bells. Eleanor's face softened at the sound, but Marcus caught the shadow that passed through her eyes, the look of a woman who'd learned that happiness was something to be guarded as carefully as gold. "You could show me," Marcus found himself saying, the words emerging before prudence could stop them. "The technique, if you're willing." Elena met his gaze then, and in her dark eyes he saw surprise, wariness, and something else, a hunger for purpose that had been long denied. "You would trust me with your work?" "I would learn from someone who knows better," Marcus replied, and realized he meant it completely. The question that hung between them was no longer whether she would stay, but whether he was ready for what her presence might reveal. The forge blazed like a small sun in the morning light, and Elena moved around it with a grace that took Marcus's breath away. She worked the bellows with perfect rhythm, her hands reading the fire's hunger as naturally as breathing. When she lifted the red-hot iron with the tongs, Marcus saw not the tentative movements of someone learning, but the fluid confidence of a master returning to familiar ground. "Hold it at this angle," she murmured, guiding his hammer to strike where the metal would yield. "Iron remembers kindness better than force." The horseshoe beneath their combined efforts took shape with an elegance Marcus had never achieved alone. Elena's corrections were subtle, a shift of angle here, an adjustment of pressure there, but each suggestion revealed depths of knowledge that made his own skills seem crude by comparison. "Where did you truly learn this?" Marcus asked between hammer strokes, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. Elena's hands never paused, but something in her shoulders tightened. "My father was the greatest smith in all Toledo," she said quietly. "He had no sons, only daughters. In Spain, some traditions bend when necessity demands." She moved to the quenching bucket, testing the water's temperature with practiced fingers. "I worked beside him for 15 years before I wed. My husband, he thought such knowledge unseemly in a wife, said it made me too proud, too independent." Marcus set down his hammer, studying her profile in the fire's glow. "Yet you remember everything. Hands remember what hearts refuse to forget." Elena's voice carried the weight of old pain. When Diego died, in the fever that took half the city, his family claimed everything. The shop, the tools, even our home. They said a woman with children had no right to work iron, that I should remarry or enter a convent. She pulled the horseshoe from the water, steam rising around her like incense. "I tried to build again, to use my father's teachings to feed my children, but they would not permit it. They said I brought shame to my husband's memory, corruption to the trade." "So you fled," Marcus said, understanding flooding through him like warm ale. "With nothing but what we could carry." Elena met his gaze then, her dark eyes fierce with remembered defiance. "They burned my workshop 3 days after we left." Miguel watched from the hillside as the smoke rose. The weight of her revelation settled between them like a blessing and a curse. Marcus looked at this woman who'd crossed half the known world to protect her children's right to survival, who carried skills that could rival any master smith in England, and felt something shift in his chest, not pity but recognition. "They were fools," he said simply. Elena's smile was small but genuine. "Perhaps, but their foolishness has become your fortune if you'll have it." Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats carried a different message entirely. The hoofbeats belonged to 2 riders whose fine cloaks and well-fed horses announced their station before they'd even dismounted. Marcus felt Elena stiffen beside him as they approached. her maternal instincts already gathering the children like a hen drawing chicks beneath protective wings. The lead rider was a thin man with calculating eyes, his companion a clerk, whose ink-stained fingers clutched a leather satchel like a weapon, Marcus Webb. The thin man's voice carried the authority of one accustomed to being answered immediately. "I am Master Thornfield, representative of Lord Ashford's interests. We've come regarding your outstanding obligations." Marcus wiped his hands on his leather apron, buying himself a moment to steady his voice. "The horseshoes are finished, as promised. Payment should settle the account." Thornfield's smile was sharp as winter steel. "I fear the matter has progressed beyond horseshoes, Master Webb. Your debt to his lordship now totals £43 sterling, including accumulated interest and penalties for late payment." The number hit Marcus like a blow from his own hammer. £43, more than most men saw in 3 years, enough to buy a small farm or outfit a knight for war. "That's impossible. I owe £8, no more. Interest compounds, Master Webb, as does the cost of my lord's patience." Thornfield's gaze swept the workshop, taking inventory with practiced efficiency. This establishment, including tools and stock, might fetch £20 at auction. The debt, however, remains. Eleanor stepped forward then, her voice calm despite the storm Marcus could see building in her dark eyes. "What do you propose?" Thornfield turned his attention to her with the lazy interest of a cat studying a mouse. "And you are?" "Someone who understands that reasonable men find reasonable solutions," Elena replied, her accent adding weight to words that might have seemed bold from another woman's lips. "Indeed." Thornfield's smile widened unpleasantly. "The Crown requires all debts settled within the fortnight, or the property reverts to Lord Ashford's holdings. Of course, skilled craftsmen are always welcome to remain as bondsmen in his lordship's service." The word hung in the air like a curse. Bondage, one step above slavery, bound to serve until death or the impossible repayment of inflated debts. Marcus felt his world tilting like a ship in heavy seas, everything he'd built sliding toward an abyss that would swallow not just his own future, but the fragile hope he'd seen growing in Eleanor's eyes. "Fortnight," Marcus repeated, his mouth dry as ash. 14 days, Thornfield confirmed, mounting his horse with fluid grace. "I trust you'll use them wisely." As their hoofbeats faded, Elena's hand found Marcus's arm. "We'll find a way," she whispered, but even her fierce determination couldn't quite mask the fear that had crept into her voice. The market square buzzed with morning commerce when Elena appeared with a small portable forge and a collection of worn tools that had belonged to her father. Word of Marcus's predicament had spread through Millhaven like smoke from a green fire, some offering sympathy, others shaking their heads at a smith too proud to manage his affairs properly. "Spanish steel," Elena announced clearly, her voice cutting through the merchant's calls, repaired, sharpened, restored to original strength. Master Fletcher, the town's weaponsmith, approached with the skeptical grin of a man who'd seen too many false promises. He carried a knight's sword, its blade notched from battle and dulled by neglect. "This belonged to Sir Godwin's grandfather," he said, laying it before Elena's makeshift workspace. "3 smiths have tried to restore it. All failed." Elena lifted the weapon, her hands reading its weight and balance like a scholar examining manuscripts. The watching crowd murmured as she traced the blade's edge with practiced fingers, noting stress points invisible to untrained eyes. "Toledo. Steel," she said softly, "folded 7 times. The original smith knew his craft." She looked up at Fletcher. "This can be saved, but it will take time and proper heat." What followed was artistry. Elena worked the small forge with efficiency that drew gasps from watchers who'd never seen a woman command fire and iron with such authority. Her hands moved in a dance of precision, heating, hammering, folding the metal back upon itself until the ancient blade sang with renewed strength. Agnes the baker stood with her mouth agape. "Mother Mary preserve us. She works like the smith saints of old." "Better than most men I've seen," muttered Thomas the carpenter, grudging respect colouring his words. When Elena finally quenched the restored blade, the crowd had grown to include half the town. Fletcher tested the edge against a copper coin, watching in amazement as it parted the metal like cloth. "By Christ's wounds," he breathed, "this is finer than when it was first forged." "The Spanish woman has golden hands," whispered Mary Sutton to her neighbour. "More than hands," replied Father Benedict, who'd watched the entire demonstration. "She has knowledge worth its weight in silver." Elena straightened, sweat beading her brow despite the cool air. Around her, the faces that had shown polite curiosity now reflected something deeper: recognition, respect, and the dawning realization that Marcus Webb's workshop housed more than one skilled artisan. "We need to speak with the guild masters," Fletcher said suddenly, his voice carrying new purpose. "A craftsman of this ability, there are laws, protections." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I seek only the right to work alongside Marcus, to help him save what generations have built." "Then by God's grace," Fletcher declared, "you shall have it." The crowd murmured agreement, but Eleanor's eyes found Marcus across the square, seeing in his face the same question that haunted her own heart. Would community support be enough to stand against Lord Ashford's power? The workshop had never known such purposeful chaos. 3 forges blazed simultaneously: Marcus's great hearth, Elena's smaller portable forge, and one hastily constructed by Thomas the carpenter from stones and determination. The air shimmered with heat waves and rang with the symphony of hammers, striking iron in perfect discord, each smith working to their own rhythm while serving the same desperate cause. 12 days, Elena called over the din, wiping sweat from her brow as she shaped another horseshoe with movements too swift for the eye to follow. 12 days to forge what should take a month. Marcus nodded grimly, his hammer never pausing, as he worked a piece that would become part of Lord Ashford's commission, elaborate ironwork for the new cathedral doors. Around them, the townspeople had transformed his solitary workshop into something resembling a guild hall during feast. Preparation. Agnes the baker tended the bellows with surprising strength, while Father Benedict sorted iron stock with the methodical precision he usually reserved for holy texts. Master Fletcher worked beside Elena, their hammers creating a counterpoint rhythm that seemed to pull the best from both craftsmen. "Spanish technique on English iron," he muttered with grudging admiration. "Never thought I'd see such marriage of traditions." In the corner, the children had appointed themselves guardians of the quenching buckets, Anna carefully testing water temperature with her finger, while Miguel and Sophia arranged finished pieces in neat rows. They worked with the quiet intensity of souls who understood that their very future hung in the balance of each perfectly struck blow. "Water's ready," Anna called, her voice bright with purpose. Elena smiled despite her exhaustion, pride warming her more than the forge fire. Her children had found their place in this dance of creation, no longer refugees, but integral parts of something larger than survival. "That's the last of the cathedral hinges," Marcus announced, lifting a piece that glowed like captured sunset. The intricate scrollwork Elena had suggested transformed functional metalwork into art worthy of God's house. Thomas stepped back from his makeshift forge, flexing fingers cramped from unaccustomed hammerwork. 20 pieces finished. "How many?" "More?" 15, Elena replied, already reaching for fresh iron. "The door handles, the sanctuary gate, and the altar rail." The workshop fell silent except for the whisper of flames. 15 pieces in 3 days. It should have been impossible, yet here they stood, a community forged by necessity into something stronger than its individual parts. "Then we work through the night," Marcus said simply, and his words carried not desperation but determination. Elena met his gaze across the forge light, seeing in his eyes the same fierce resolve that had driven her across half the world. Together, she agreed. Outside, storm clouds gathered with ominous purpose, as if the very heavens conspired against their efforts. The guild hall had never held so many souls at once. Every bench overflowed with townspeople who'd come not as spectators, but as witnesses to something unprecedented in Millhaven's history. When Master Thornfield entered with his clerk and 2 armed guards, the collective silence that greeted him carried the weight of unified purpose. Marcus stood before the assembly, Eleanor at his side, while their finished ironwork gleamed on tables arranged like an altar of craftsmanship. The cathedral pieces caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, each scroll and curve testament to skills that had transformed burden into beauty. "The debt stands at £43, Thornfield announced, his voice echoing. "In the vaulted space, I trust you have not gathered us here for empty gestures." Master Fletcher rose from the front bench, his weathered hands holding a document bearing the guild's official seal. "We have gathered to present a formal proposal to his lordship," he declared. "The establishment of a recognized smithy partnership between Marcus Webb and Elena de Torres, with full guild endorsement and community backing." Thornfield's eyebrows rose skeptically. "A woman cannot hold guild membership. She can hold recognition as master craftsman under ancient provision," Father Benedict interjected, producing a leather-bound tome. "Canon law from the time of Henry's grandfather allows for exceptional skills to supersede gender restrictions when community need demands." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying across the hushed hall. "I seek not charity, but the right to work honorably alongside Master Webb. Our combined efforts have produced work worthy of God's house." Agnes the baker stood, her voice trembling but determined. "We pledged £12 toward the debt settlement. 8 more from the Carpenters' Guild," Thomas called out. 15 from private subscription," added Master Fletcher. One by one, pledges rose from the assembled crowd until the sum reached £38, more than enough to satisfy the original debt before Thornfield's inflated penalties. "Furthermore," Father Benedict continued, "the bishop himself has commissioned additional work for the cathedral restoration. Payment, £40, to be divided between the partnership as they see fit." Thornfield's composure cracked for the first time. "This is highly irregular." "What's irregular," interrupted a new voice from the doorway, "is a Lord Steward attempting to rob honest craftsmen through usury." Sir Edmund Blackwood, the bishop's own representative, entered with authority that made even Thornfield's guards step aside. "His lordship will accept the community's settlement offer, plus interest at the church's approved rate. The matter is concluded." Marcus felt Elena's hand slip into his as the hall erupted in voices of relief and celebration. But it was the quiet pressure of her fingers, the warmth of shared triumph, that told him the real victory was only beginning. Outside, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayer and new beginnings. The workshop had grown, like a living thing, walls pushed outward to accommodate the second forge that now glowed beside Marcus's original hearth. Where once a single man had labored in solitude, 2 smiths now moved in practiced harmony, their hammers creating rhythms that spoke of partnership earned through fire and trust. Eleanor's tools hung beside Marcus's on the expanded wall, no longer visitors, but permanent residents in a space that had learned to breathe with larger lungs. Above, the living quarters had transformed as well. What had been Marcus's cramped bachelor chamber now sprawled across the entire upper floor, with proper beds for the children and a solar where Eleanor could mend clothes by natural light. The children's laughter echoed through spaces that had known only silence for too long. their voices weaving warmth into corners that winter had never quite left. Marcus watched Elena as she demonstrated scroll work to Miguel, her patient explanations, mixing Spanish and English in the boy's eager ears. The child showed promise that went beyond bloodline. His small hands already understood the conversation between hammer and iron that separated true smiths from mere metalworkers. "He has the gift," Elena said softly, catching Marcus's observation. "Like his father did, before drink stole his steadiness. They work now not from desperation but from purpose, their commissions arriving from as far as Winchester and York. Word of their combined skills had spread like ripples from a stone, dropped in still water, carrying the promise of craftsmanship that honored both Spanish tradition and English practicality. "The bishop's courier came today," Marcus said, setting aside the altar cross that would grace St. Bartholomew's new chapel. "He's commissioned a full set of sanctuary implements, 40 pieces, payment on completion." Elena nodded, her attention seemingly focused on the delicate filigree she was adding to a nobleman's dagger hilt. But Marcus caught the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth, satisfaction that went deeper than pride in workmanship. "We'll need to take on an apprentice," she said casually. "Perhaps two, if the work continues to grow." The word, we settled between them like a benediction. Not you or I, but we, a partnership that had evolved beyond convenience into something neither had dared name aloud. Anna appeared in the workshop doorway, her dark eyes bright with the particular mischief of a child who'd discovered adult secrets. "Mama," she announced with 7-year-old solemnity, "Marcus has been carving something in the back room, something small and round." Elena's hands stilled on her work, and Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with forge fire. Some conversations, he realized, could no longer be postponed. The evening light slanted through the workshop windows, just as it had that first night when desperation had driven Marcus's hammer against unyielding iron. But now the anvil sang a different song, not the desperate rhythm of a man racing against ruin, but the measured cadence of a craftsman shaping joy into something lasting. Eleanor stood beside him, her own hammer keeping counterpoint as they worked together on a commission that belonged to no lord or bishop. Between them, a simple band of gold took shape, formed not from the crude iron that had once been their daily bread, but from precious metal that spoke of prosperity earned through skill and partnership. "Not too wide," Elena murmured, adjusting the angle of her strike. "It should feel like a promise, not a shackle." Marcus smiled at the distinction, understanding born of shared experience coloring her words. Around them, the children moved through evening tasks with the easy confidence of souls who knew their place in the world. Miguel tended the cooling forge with careful attention, while Anna and Sophia arranged finished pieces for tomorrow's delivery to the abbey. Through the open doorway, Marcus could see the lights beginning to twinkle in cottage windows across Millhaven. The town had grown prosperous in the months since their partnership became official. Merchants drawn by the reputation of Webb and de Torres metalwork, craftsmen seeking apprenticeships under masters whose combined knowledge bridged two great traditions. "The Flemish merchant's son arrived today," Elena said, her voice carrying quiet satisfaction. "He'll make a fine apprentice, I think, eager to learn but not too proud to start with the bellows." Marcus nodded, remembering his own boyhood spent watching his father's hands transform raw iron into necessity and beauty. The workshop that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with the voices of young men, learning ancient arts, their enthusiasm adding brightness to walls that had forgotten the sound of hope. Elena lifted the ring with delicate tongs, studying its curve in the firelight. "It's ready," she said simply. Marcus set down his hammer and turned to face her fully, seeing in her dark eyes the same wonder that had first appeared when she'd realized this place might offer more than mere shelter. "Are you?" he asked softly. Her answer came not in words, but in the way she reached for his soot-stained hand, intertwining their fingers with the natural grace of two halves, finding completion. From the doorway, 3 small voices rose in delighted chorus. Finally! Outside, the cathedral bells began their evening call, their bronze voices carrying across a town where a Spanish woman and an English smith had discovered that the strongest metal was not iron or steel, but the bonds forged between hearts that chose to build rather than simply survive.